Hey everyone, hello and welcome to a live feed, a very special live feed, as this one is going to try to address all of your questions in a how-to video on how to take your Super Nintendo Classic and to do a USB modification with Hakchi CE. I'm just going to try and stabilize everything, including the camera. So apologies for the shakes right at this very start. If I just get that all in place, we should be okay. So hopefully you can see my screen. I'm going to start by zooming in and give you the list. This list will be below the video once after the live stream is finished. So to start off with, you're going to need a few requirements. So I've started off with the human requirements. It's really important that you are patient and you are prepared. And I'm going to go through this video and obviously show you how to be prepared. But the most important thing I guess you can have is some patience. I'm hoping that this video takes about 40 minutes. If it takes any longer, then my wife will have to kind of slow down the cooking of my dinner for this evening. Next of all, we're going to have the hardware requirements. Of course, you're going to need a Super Nintendo Classic Mini. That's number 3 there, but really, I guess it should be the first thing. Next thing, you're going to need an on-the-go USB adapter with power input, and you're also going to need some USB storage. Now, I will provide all the links to all of these things underneath the video once it's been recorded. Also, in terms of the software side, you're going to need to download Hakchi CE or Hakchi 2 CE, the latest build. There'll be a link to that. Also, you'll need to go and get KMFD Manix HMod set, and I think I've got 2 M's there, so I'm just going to remove one and save that. Also, you'll need some SNES Classic firmware. Now, because I've got the European Super Nintendo Mini, you'll need to get. I'm gonna use the US and the Japanese because that's the missing firmware for the Super Nintendo. Also, I'm going to use the NES Classic firmware for the US region and the Japanese region. So I'll have the Famicom, the International NES. I'll have the Super Famicom and the US Super Nintendo firmware eventually, as well as the stock. One of the last things, I guess, is the boot screen image. I've done a boot screen image for my Super Nintendo, and I'll share that with you. It'll be a link. It'll be a link to a video. It looks like I've got there. I will actually sort this one out, but I'll put the correct link below the video when I'm finished. And also some ROMs. You're going to want to run ROMs. So this is just a start. I know 2 people are watching. This is going to last about 40 minutes, I'm hoping, but it's going to take us all the way through taking your Super Nintendo and making it into an all-singing, all-dancing emulation station. So there's my Super Nintendo right now. So the first thing, all I can say is it's fully flashed and it's got lots of different things on there. So I'm going to return it to stock. And to do that, you're going to want to follow these instructions. So I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. There we go. You might not be able to see, but just bear with me. So the first thing I'm going to do is minimize those instructions. And this is the root directory on the right of the USB. So the first thing you should do is download all of the requirements that I've asked you to download, and then extract Hakchi 2 CE, extract that to the USB drive. Now, once it's on the USB drive, you are going to want to open up that folder, and you're going to want to run Hakchi exe. Now, this is the first time I'm running it here, so I'm going to choose my region, which is Europe SNES. It's done that. Okay. So I'm now going to check some settings just to stop it nagging me. So I'm going to ask it to disable the Hakchi 2 pop-ups, which stops those things. I'm going to center box art thumbnail. There we go. So that's the first bit done. I've opened it up. I'm now going to want to put the stock firmware back. And again, if you've already got a Super Nintendo, if you've not done anything, you can skip this step. But right now, my Super Nintendo has has a previous firmware on. So I'm going to return it back to stock. And to do that, I'm going to go and get my original firmware, which whenever you actually flash, you should always save your original firmware. I've got it here. And I'm going to make sure my original firmware is in a dump folder, which is in the Hakchi 2 folder. So again, this process here is just about returning my Super Nintendo firmware to stock. So to do that, you click on kernel and flash factory kernel right here. However, because I've also got lots of H mods, I'm going to uninstall. So yeah, I want to return it to its factory state. Next of all, I have to hold the reset button on the Super Nintendo and power it on. It is connected to the PC right now. After a moment or so, the console enters what we call FEL mode, or FEL mode for short. One syllable versus three there. I'll zoom in just slightly so that you can see the details, but if you follow this guide, it's not too tricky. So I appreciate a lot of it. People that may be looking at this video may already have a complete kind of, fresh out the box Super Nintendo classic. Okay, now I've uninstalled, I'm going to flash the factory kernel. Again, I have to enter FEL mode, so I switch the Nintendo off from the previous flash. Wait a second, and then I'm going to hold down reset and power back on. And now we're flashing the factory firmware. So first of all, remove any traces of any previous installation. That's all the H mods, all the cores, RetroArch, and now I'm putting on the original factory firmware. Once this is done, it's really important that you verify the factory firmware is back on there. And to do that, all you have to do is boot your Super Nintendo and just check that everything looks okay. Again, I'm going to say right at the start of this video, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to leave a comment. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer all comments, all sensible comments anyway. Here we go, nearly done now. Okay, so that's done. I'm just going to switch inputs to the Super Nintendo. I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to switch the Nintendo off and back on again. So what we're looking for now is it booting to the stock firmware. That sure looks like stock. I already have some saves which I'm not prepared to wipe because my wife would kill me. Hey, nice one. So I'm just going to check it's back to stock, and the way we do this, we look at the legal notices and we check if it mentions right at the very top, just at this part here, if it mentions Hakchi, which it doesn't. So we know we're back at stock, and I've uninstalled all of the modifications previously. So this is the point at which people will be jumping on that haven't done any modding before with their Super Nintendo. And for those old timers that have been doing this for a while, this is where we start to get things done. So what I'm going to copy, in addition to the root directory in my Nintendo, during this entire how-to, please ignore the one I prepared earlier folder. I'm just not prepared to lose all of the earlier work that I did in sorting all my ROMs out, so I've put them all in this side. So this really is the only file folder you should have on the root right now. But we're going to want a little bit more. We're going to want some firmware, and I'll zoom in so you can see this. This contains all the firmware that I will give you the links to. So we've got the Japanese NES firmware, the Famicom firmware. We've got the global NES firmware. We have the Super Famicom firmware and the USA firmware. So I'm going to copy this entire folder onto my USB drive. Links will be below the video after this has been filmed. Next, you want to take that nice download from KMFD Manic. This is all of the RetroArch cores, everything. It's quite large, but unzip it and copy that directory into the root as well of your SD or your USB drive. I'm using a USB 3 stick, and that's mainly for fast transfer speed, which is important if you're going to have thousands of ROMs later on. I'm also going to copy across the ROMs folder just so it's in place on the external USB stick. So in the ROMs, I'm going to tell you what I've got there before we start. I've got Afterburner for the 32X, Aladdin for the Sega Master System, Bonk's Adventure for the PC Engine, F-Zero for the N64, King of Fighters 99 for the Neo Geo, Pokemon Ruby for the Game Boy Advance, Simpsons Bart versus the Space Mutants for the Mega Drive or the Genesis, and I've got Super Mario All-Stars with Super Mario World for the Super Nintendo. Okay. So here is the next step. Very simple. Let's just move these out the way to either side. Hopefully you can see Hakchi now. And I'll just center it the best I can. I'm not sure what's going on here. I've lost my mouse. For some reason it's not being controlled. Let me just check if my keyboard's okay. No, it's not. Okay, looked to be a slight issue there with the hub that I'm using, but it's back. So I'm just going to move that up. So now that we're back on factory firmware, I want to flash the custom kernel from Hakchi. So go to the kernel menu, flash custom kernel. Do you want to do it? Sure do. Now it should ask me if I want to go into FEL mode. Obviously I think I've got USB issues with my machine right now, which isn't ideal during a live stream, so please forgive this. Okay, mouse working, keyboard working. Everything seems okay, so I'm just going to quit out of Hakchi right now because there seems to be a minor issue here. Okay, so let's try again. Kernel, flash custom kernel. Do you want to flash it? Yes. And it says the device is not ready. To get the device ready, I'm just going to hold down reset and turn the Super Nintendo on and put it in FEL mode. Okay, I'm just going to bring in the debug window so you can see what I'm doing here as well. I'm just waiting to see if it picks it up, but it hasn't. This has always been pain-free in the past. I'm surprised it's having a problem now. So I'm just going to relaunch Hakchi. I'm going to relaunch Hakchi on the external drive. So I'm going to go into the Hakchi folder and relaunch. There we go. Kernel, flash custom. Yep, I want to do it. Okay, seems to be making a move now. That's great. Just a minor hiccup on the road to success. That's why I said as one of the most important things you have to have here is patience. You know, things can go wrong. And if you look in the debug window that pops open, you will see errors occasionally. I'm not sure what those errors are referring to, but it's debug software. It's a debug window, and it's there just to give you notification if there are problems. So this doesn't take too long. What this flashing process does, this custom flashing, is it does flash your Super Nintendo for USB host as well as Hakchi CE features. Once this is done, what we'll be doing is we will be closing Hakchi down and booting the Super Nintendo to verify that Hakchi 2 CE is installed. As you know, we've already looked at the firmware and we could tell that Hakchi wasn't installed because when we looked at the legal notices, there was no mention of Hakchi at all. So once this is done, we will verify. It's very important because you know it's all about building up the right steps so that you don't make mistakes. So this video is being made on the 24th of February 2018. If you're watching this later, especially several weeks or several months later, please ensure you use the latest version of Hakchi from the link that is below the video. Obviously, I'm just going to be showing you the version 1.1.0 and of course any features that are within that. Okay, so that looks good. It's just uploading the kernel now. So the goal of this is to have a Super Nintendo that has all of the Nintendo classic consoles. So that's the NES, the Famicom, the Super Famicom, and the Super Nintendo other region. You know, if you've got a US, it'll be the European. If you've got the European, it'll be the US. Also on top of that, I'm going to put RetroArch on there and various console, non-Nintendo console ROMs. But again, at each stage, I will pause just to kind of give a summary of where we're up to so that if you only want to do one particular task, if you swipe through this video and find the bit that you want, we should be there. So it says it's done and we can now upload some games. I'm not interested in uploading games right this minute. I just want to verify that that installation of the firmware, the custom firmware, was successful. So I'm going to switch back to the Nintendo Classic. Obviously, we've only got stock games on there right now, but to see if it was successful, I'm going to look at the legal notices. Excellent stuff. This modded system is not for resale. That's what I wanted to see. So I'm going to come back out and I'm going to switch back to the PC. I haven't powered the Nintendo off at this time. Okay, so that's what we've got so far. So I guess the next step, I would say, and again, I'm just thinking out loud, it's going to be to copy everything obviously we've got on the USB drive already. Let me zoom in. And I'll just get the windows side by side. So we've got Hakchi and we've got the USB drive contents on the right. And if we look at the console on the left, if you go to settings and console type, it's the console that I'm using right now, which is the Super Nintendo Europe or US. So first thing I'm going to do is copy all the firmware, every single one. In fact, no, I'm going to do them one at a time, just so we don't confuse things. So first thing I'm going to do the Super Nintendo USA. Drag it into the window on the left. And I'm going to name it SNES. If I can work around the tripod stand. SNES US. Now, I could Google and give it an icon, but I think, yeah, let's do that. Okay, it's timed out. I'll do it one more time. Again, there's no reason why I should have to give it an icon. I could just leave it as the standard one, just to speed up the how-to. I'm sure you all know how to do this bit, so I'm just going to leave it as is for now. The next one I'm going to drag in is the, I think this is the Super Famicom one. It's the one that has SHVC in the title. I'll drag it in. And just for saving typing in, I'm going to put SNES JAP. Next, I'll bring the NES Classic firmware in. And there it is coming in. So this is the NES Classic. And finally, I bring in the NES from Japan, which is the Famicom. Bring that in and give that the NES Jap. Okay, so that is all of those. So obviously I'm going to be able to switch to all of the other firmwares right there. One extra thing I think we want to be able to do at this stage is to have a link to the existing firmware that's on this machine. And to do that, I think we just right click. In fact, let me see if I can do it here. Go to File. Is it there? It's not. I did want to add a link, a custom link. Just wondering if it's going to let me do that. It's not going to let me do that at this stage, so we'll just flash these on there. So yeah, US, Japan, Classic, and Japan. So we should be good there. Again, I'm not doing this from a script. I'm just trying to make sure I get everything on. So I guess now that we've got those extra ones, we just want to say export games. So I'm going to click on export. I'm not going to give them an icon at this stage. And I'm going to export them to my USB drive. And I'm going to say use linked export. The reason for this is so that it doesn't copy the files that are already on the USB drive to another folder on the USB drive, taking up twice the amount of space or more. I'm going to do that, and it's just now writing the menu to my to the USB drive. So we can see we've got our Super Nintendo European folder here in this particular folder structure, and it's created that folder structure. So we've now got a new folder called Hakchi. Inside it there's games, and inside that there's SNES Europe, because that is the console that we've been working with in the Hakchi menu. I'm also going to create at this point a folder called saves, and that will mean that all the saves will go from all the consoles that we're going to look at today. All the saves will end up in this folder. Okay, so that's pretty much it. What we have now is a USB drive that will boot. It will contain all of the original games, as we've stated here on the left, but it will also contain links to the other firmware. Hey, that's no problem, Willem. Okay, if you don't want the original games because you've already got them on the console, feel free to dump them, but it's your choice. I'm just going to keep the original games there. So I'm going to close Hakchi down. I'm going to eject the USB, and then I'm going to bring up my on-the-go adapter, and I'm going to plug in the USB to one of the on-the-go adapter arms, or the sockets if you like. And the other end I'm going to put in the Super Nintendo Classic. I'm going to zoom out for this. Okay, and just reposition this down. So up until now we've been dealing directly with the Super Nintendo there. But I'm just going to want to test that everything's working at this stage. So get that in the right way, and then get this in the right way. I'll switch, input, and then power on. Now at this point we don't have a custom boot screen, so this is a standard boot screen that comes. It lets you know that the modification was successful. I'm going to choose OK, and what we can now see is we see all the games that were there and an additional folder called More Games. Now, this is the default way that it does it. It puts all of the additional games in here, or all of the additional firmwares in here. So you'll see these icons for all the other firmwares that we added. I'm just going to quickly check that they work. The console reboots at this stage, so the light goes out and comes back on. and then it should boot to the NES Classic firmware. Now the problem we have at this stage is that we didn't put an icon in here to return back to the Super Nintendo firmware. So we're at a dead end. We can turn the machine off and we can turn it back on. But what you'll see is it always boots to the firmware that was in use last. That doesn't mean that you've bricked your Super Nintendo. You can just take out the USB stick and it will boot to the standard Super Nintendo firmware. But we're talking about the USB in this example. So what we're going to want to do here is we're going to want to use Hakchi to add an icon in here in the NES firmware to be able to go back to the Super Nintendo firmware. So I'm just going to power down. There we go. And I'm going to take out, I'm going to go back to PC very quickly. And I'm going to take out the USB and I'm going to insert it back into the computer. There we go. So now that we've got the drive open, we're going to launch Hakchi 2 once again, and then I'll zoom in on the program. I'll just center up a little bit more. Sorry about this. I know it's awkward reading when it's off center. Okay, so this is the Super Nintendo, how we had it. This is a Super Nintendo firmware, but we now need to look at the NES firmware. So we're going to change console type, noting that at this point we're not actually bothered about the Nintendo. It's not connected directly to the PC. It's connected via the on-the-go adapter. So we're just messing around now with the USB setting content. So we're going to change over here to NES Europe. It takes a moment and then loads the games list for NES Europe, as you can see right here. Now we want to add to this a return path to the SNES firmware. Now I believe we should be able to create a custom setting here somehow. I'm just looking for how to do that in Hakchi CE. Previously I did it in Hakchi 2. So let me have a look. Okay, now there's one of two ways to do this. We should be able to create a custom. I'm just looking for it. It doesn't seem like it's allowing us to create a custom link. Maybe add more games? No, that's just browsing. Kernel, dump kernel. Maybe advanced. It's not in there. Presets, it's not in there. Won't be modules, won't be in there. Okay, so it doesn't look like this Hakchi CE version has a way to add a link to the original firmware back. So what I'm going to do is I am going to trick it. And the way I'm going to trick it is I'm going to go to my firmware folder in the root, and I am going to, let's see, I will bring in one of the other firmwares. I'll bring in the US firmware for now, and I'll just drag it into the window. Now I'm not actually looking to launch the US firmware here. What I'm looking to do is return to the SNES Classic. And instead of using the command line that we have down here, let me just bring that up. Instead of using the command line, I'm going to wipe everything else off and I'm just going to say auto. So it's not actually going to be using that folder, I don't think. Just let me double check. Return to NES Classic. Yep. Do that. Okay, that's fine. Let's export the games now. Yep. Let's do a linked export. Always do a linked export. So now you'll notice that in the Hakchi folder, if I bring it across, you've got the games. We created the SNES Europe. Now we've got the NES USA. So if I close this, eject the USB drive, plug it into my on-the-go, and if I boot it, zoom out, let's see what it boots to now. Now, the previous firmware was the Hakchi NES firmware, which we're back to. And it's created, there we go, the original game's back here in the root. So as I've already said, whenever you add anything, it automatically makes this extra folder called More Games. And then in that More Games folder, I've got Return to NES Classic. So let's hit it and see what it does. Fingers crossed it will use that auto command that I put in there and return back to this standard firmware on your device. Yep, it seems to have done that. It's returned back to the standard firmware and we're in the folder now containing the other firmware. So I'll just check that this is a standard firmware. And it is. You can see all the games here. So now we can go in between the NES firmware, which I'll boot to here if I want to. I could boot to the Japanese firmware, but of course we don't have a link in there to return. We don't have a link in here to return. Spell that incorrectly, clearly. And we don't have a link here to return. So it's all about creating the different firmwares and having links to return. So let's come back here. I'll turn off the Super Nintendo and we'll go through it all in one lump. So you understand what we're doing. We're switching between the firmwares and we're creating a return path to other firmwares. So let's turn off. Go back to the PC, which I will do when my monitor wakes up. There we go, and I'll insert this into the USB and zoom in. So now I'm going to be doing a lot of work in Hakchi to make this work. So I'm going to launch the interface again. I'm going to zoom in as much as I can within reason. Now we've got the NES open here and I've got the return to SNES Classic. But what I'm wanting to do is ideally I want to be able to switch between firmwares. I don't want to have to keep going back to the SNES Classic just to switch from the NES US to the Famicom or whatever. You know, I just want to be able to switch whenever I want to. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close this down at this point. In fact, let's just have a look. There we go. You can actually see the folder where these reside. So I'm going to go back to the Super Nintendo that we had. Now we're back on the Super Nintendo. We've got these, which I'd like to move them into the NES Classic firmware so I don't have to recreate them from scratch. They already exist, so to speak, in these folders. So if I just right-click on here and say Show in Windows Explorer, we can see the folder here in the games SNES. And it's CLV-Z or Z, depending on where you're from. So here they are. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Why are there 5? I'm not sure. Okay, that's one of them. That's another. Oh, there's 4. Okay, well, let's take all 4. And we're going to copy and paste them from the games_SNES into the games, like that. So fingers crossed now when I switch back to the NES, it should have the links down the bottom for all the firmwares. And as you can see, it does have the links down the bottom for all the firmwares. You have to check them and click Export Games to export them back into the menu. So before we go any further, I'm fed up of seeing that More Games folder. I want to arrange things the way I want to arrange them. So you have to go into the Settings, Page Folder Structure, and click on Custom. Do that for all of them. So console type, NES, I've just done that for. Let's do it for the Famicom. Let's make this customizable. Let's do it for the SNES Europe. let's make them customizable. And let's do it for the Super Famicom. And again, let's make the folder structure customizable. Now we're still focusing on the NES. Again, I did say at the start of this video that you'd need patience, so please be patient. So we go into the NES one. We can see we've added those extra ones in there. We're happy to have the original games and those. So we're going to click Export Games. As always, we'll always create the linked export as to not make duplicates. And now you can see it's giving the option, instead of having this More Games folder, we've got these particular ones. And they're kind of mixed up amongst all of the ROMs. I'm not happy about that. I'd rather have them at one end, or you could put them in a folder. So I'm just going to click on cancel and say no, I don't want to save it. And I'm going to rename these. I'm going to rename them with a number in front of them. And by doing this, you could change the sort name here, I guess. But I'm actually just going to number them. Again, many different ways to do a different setup. I'm going to change that to Super Nintendo Entertainment System as well. I can definitely tell you this video is going to take longer than 40 minutes and my wife's going to be upset. So I will just have a word with her to put my dinner on pause. So as you can see, we've named them 1, 2, 3, and 4 now. We'll click Export Games. We'll say Linked Export, and they'll be at the top of the list. So you should see them on the left-hand side, and then the rest of the games there. We'll say OK, and in a very short time, it'll export that folder structure. We're going to go back to the Super Nintendo as well, our existing firmware, the original firmware, and we'll just make sure that these also have the 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4 there. Correcting any spelling mistakes as we go, or you could change this to Famicom or Super Famicom because that's what it is. It's entirely up to you. I'm just showing you or trying to give you an idea of how everything gets linked together. Okay, so they're all there now. Export Games. I'm going to create the linked. You can see they're all there on the left of the games. And say OK. Just takes a brief second to do this. The games are a little bit bigger than the NES games. And that is done. I'm just going to close these windows that it opened up. So the next thing is to go back to the Super Nintendo and let's have a look at how that's affected things. I'm sure you can imagine it's basically like before, but we won't have that extra More Games folder. Let me zoom out. You've got the default boot screen, which will change shortly. You've got all the original games, but to the left of them, you've got the links there to the other firmware. So as you know, at the moment, we've got 2 firmwares completely sorted out with links back to this. So I'm going to click on NES Classic. The console light goes out. After a second, it comes back on again. We see the boot screen. And then it'll boot to the NES firmware. And there it is. There's the NES firmware. And of course, down one end at the bottom, if you look at those little thumbnails, you'll see that we've got a link to all of these. You'll also see that it's missing the number 4. It's missing the number 1 at this time. Not going to worry about that. I'm just going to go back to the Super Nintendo firmware. Let's see. Where has it gone? It seems to have disappeared, doesn't it? Okay, maybe that's my bad. We should have had return in there as well. Clearly I made a mistake, so I'm just going to switch this off and put the USB back in the PC. Out it comes, and in it goes back to the PC. I'll zoom in. And I'm going to launch Hakchi from the usual folder. There we go. So as you can see, we're looking right now at the Super Nintendo, but we need to be looking at the mistake we made for the NES. I can't see any return to Super Nintendo, but I guess we don't need the NES Classic, do we? Because we're already in the NES Classic. So I'm going to borrow this one, and I'm just going to say auto here. This is the command line. Saying auto after the /bin/hsqs with an auto will just return back to the firmware, on the native firmware, if you like, of your device. And I'm going to change the label to say NES, SNES Classic there. So that should do enough. Just going to export that now linked. Does that very quickly. I'm going to close everything down and just verify that that extra icon now is in place. Patience really is the key with all this, guys. It takes a hell of a long time. If I wanted to, I could just show the folder structure I end up with, and everything's in there. So I'm going to turn it on. That'd help. In order to speed this video up, and for the 11 people that are still watching, what I will do is I will eventually, in a few minutes, go to the here's one I prepared earlier, because once I've shown you how to do the NES, it's just a rinse and repeat for all the others. So now you can see I should have a way back to the SNES Classic. That's the auto, which returns me to my native operating system. I could obviously go to the others right now, but there'd be no way back. So I'm just saying get back to the native. NES comes up. There we go. And next thing, yep, you can see here we're back on the native firmware, if you like. So my next step is to add a custom boot screen. So return back to the PC. I'm going to plug in the USB, wake the PC up because it's gone on to sleep. Hopefully I can wake it up. My apologies for this. Occasionally happens. There we go. I'm going to relaunch Hakchi. In fact, there's no need to relaunch Hakchi for this next step. What you should have is you should have your Hakchi folder in your SD or USB drive, whatever you're using. And in this Hakchi folder, you're going to transfer the link, which will be under this video once I've completed it. You're going to transfer the boot PNG. Here's the boot PNG that there will be a link to. And just transfer that into the Hakchi folder. The boot PNG looks something like this. And as you can see, that looks considerably better than the temporary default Hakchi boot screen. So I'm going to unplug the USB there, put it back in the on-the-go, and switch over. So it switches on. It should display the old boot screen for just a brief second, and then it copies the boot.png internally, and that will now be the boot screen that we use. So every time we switch this machine on now, it's going to come through that boot process where it shows that nice splash screen when it starts. So turn back on. And because it already has the boot PNG, we see that immediately now. Okay, let's get back to Hakchi CE. So I'm just powering down the Nintendo and ejecting the USB drive. So what have we done so far? Well, we've set up the Super Nintendo with USB on the go. We've set up various firmwares, but what we haven't done is rinse and repeat. So I'm just going to very quickly show you how to rinse and repeat and get everything where it needs to be. So this is the NES firmware, and it's got the 4 additional links to it. We're going to look at the US firmware next. This is the US SNES. It looks, in fact, it is exactly the same menu as we have for the European. The only difference is when we hit export games, we tick or check, we click on the US radio box and say link to export. So if we export now, it does that nice and quick, and it creates the folder SNES USA. So if we go back here and have a look, we've got an NES USA, an SNES Europe, and an SNES USA. Next up, I'm going to do the Super Famicom. And as you can see, this also shares these links, which I'm just going to check. I guess we want the NES Classic to be the default, don't we? So we're just going to have to change this to the SNES, and we'll make this auto. So now we've got the SNES. We'll make that number 1. So SNES Classic, NES, yep, that all looks okay. Am I missing something here? Oh, I am. I've done this perhaps in the wrong order. Yep, I have. My fault. So let's just call that the NES Classic. And I'd love to get that. Oh, it has. It's snapped back to where it was. That's good. Because this is the Japanese Super Famicom, we're going to replace the Japanese Super Famicom. It's silly of me not to. So I'm just going to do that. So in other words, always replace the one in the list from the one that you're actually using. Slightly confusing, I know. But basically, it's just making sure that you've got a link back to your original SNES Classic firmware and access to the others that you'll be doing. So that is that. Yep. So export games. Yep. Link to export. Do that. Hit the button. Get that out there. You can see now it's made an SNES Japan folder as well. I think the last one that we did, we need just to get that one right. That was the SNES USA. Okay, so that's auto. Right, so that's the USA one. We don't really want that. I wonder if I can undo it. Okay, no, it doesn't look like we can. So I'm just wondering how to get back to that. I'm guessing I can look at the NES or one of the others. Even though I'm getting slightly confused now, guys. So in the Super Famicom, we want the US firmware. So this is the US firmware link. And we're looking to put the US firmware in there, which it is. Go back to that classic, which was auto. I guess is that right? That's the US. That's the classic. What's missing? I'm trying to work out what's missing here, guys. That's okay. That's going to be the NES release. We can see that. That's Japan. That's okay. That's the classic. That's okay. We're already in this particular one, and that's okay, I guess. Okay. Just let me click on export and just make sure it's exported anyway. I think the final one we need to do is the Famicom, the NES Japan. We don't have one for that yet, do we? Let me double check in the folder structure. Hakchi games. So the NES Europe and 3 SNES consoles. So yeah, we do need the Famicom. So I'm going to come back here and just export the Famicom one out. There we go. And of course I'm going to have to tick all these tick boxes. And yeah, I can see that you've got to make sure you get the links correct anyway. That's going to be the big challenge. So once you've done that, let's just assume that that is all done now and working fine. So I'm just going to click on export and say, go for it, links export. So now that we've done that, we should be able to see in the Hakchi games folder that there are 5 consoles, 2 NES and 3 SNES. Switching over to the Super Nintendo, we should be able to see, once I zoom out, that we can now boot to the other consoles and return back. Basically switching between other consoles at ease. Well, you've seen the NES, let's have a look at the Famicom now. The light goes out, the console reboots or does a cycle. We'll see the boot screen, the custom boot screen that I added in the last step. And now we should see the Japanese firmware. There you go, you can see all of that's there. Now unfortunately, I've got the more games folder. I guess I didn't change the folder structure on this. I'm going to go back to the SNES Classic via a boot cycle. Then we're going to take a look at the SNES US firmware. The first time you boot any of the firmware, you do have to choose the language, but once it's stored, it should be stored for forever. So we see a boot cycle. I guess I could have switched directly to it, and I think that's what I will do for the final one. So of course, what you can see now is the lilac, the purple colours that come from the US SNES firmware. And finally, I want to go to the Japan firmware, but because I got my links wrong, I'm just going to go via the original. All the games are there from the US system. But hopefully this last 50 minutes has shown you how to install and do a multi-boot system. You just have to be careful adding the links back to the correct one. Now we'll look at the Super Famicom. Again, we go through the boot cycle whenever we boot a new firmware. But with some care and attention, you should be able to get all of the links correctly labelled and the paths correct. As you can see, here's all the Super Famicom firmware as well. So, with any luck, I'm going to return back to the stock firmware now. And I'm going to show you how to add HMODs. I'm going to try to do this all within a very short window of time, because I get the feeling my dinner is nearly ready. How are you guys doing in here? Oh, you pause. I'll try and be quick. Okay, looks like I've got a little bit of extra time to get this job done. I did say it was an ultimate how-to, so it should really cover everything. So yeah, we're back on the European firmware there, and I'm going to go back to the PC. Once I turn off the Nintendo, there we go. Don't remove the USB until the light's gone out on the Super Nintendo. You don't want to corrupt any files and have any problems. So I'm going to zoom in now and we're going to focus on running other consoles' ROMs. So we've got the boot screen, we've got all the firmware working. If you want to run other consoles' ROMs, ask yourself the question, which firmware do you want to do it from? You know, for me, you could put some in each one. You could have the Genesis ones in the Super Famicom. You could have, you know, the 32X ones in the NES. But come on, let's think about this in a kind of, you know, focused way. You only really need them in one firmware. So choose one firmware, usually your native firmware. Choose that firmware and put everything in there. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add a lot of other HMODs. The HMODs, by the way, are shared by all the firmwares. So if you do want to split them up, you just have to add the HMODs once. Add the emulators once, if you like. Add the RetroArch cores once. So I'm going to go in there and open Hakchi CE again. I think I've got 2 windows open that I don't need. Okay. Why is it asking me to choose? Maybe because I am in the wrong folder. Yeah, that was the folder on my desktop. I closed the wrong one down there, so don't worry about it. This is just a separate folder structure. So let me open up the USB one more time, and we'll focus on copying those HMODs across and getting RetroArch set up. So yes, now we're going to play other systems ROMs. That's what I'm talking about. Playing other systems ROMs on the Super Nintendo. So I'm going to change back to my main firmware, the SNES US Europe. And I am going to add some modifications. Now, if you remember in one of the first steps, we actually copied across KMFD Manic's set of cores. So, and we've also copied across some ROMs here. So I'm going to open the ROMs folder, and I'm going to see that we need the 32X core. We need the 32X core to run this game. So we're going to go into KMFD Manic's folder, and we're going to copy absolutely every one of the files in the root. Every single one of them we're going to copy, and we're going to put them in the new modules. So open up the install extra modules, and then you'll see there's only a few in there right now, but we're going to drag every one of these across and put them in here. So that should take a moment or two to do, but effectively it's basically just copying them all into a different folder. I could have done it manually, but I'm doing it via the interface because you may want to do one at a time. You may want to do all of them, but I'm just going to put them all in there, and then I can choose what I want to add. So I'm going to bring up the ROMs folder again, so I'm only adding the ones that I need. So on the right here, I'm going to space them out a little bit. Maybe you can see a little bit better then. If I can get them the right part. Can everyone see that? You can see the ROMs on the right hand side, and you can see the mods here. So first of all, I'm going to have to put the actual RetroArch on there. So we're going to look through the list, and we're going to find RetroArch. Now I believe the latest one seems to be 1.71. So I'm clicking on KM RetroArch 171 standard. And it's actually dated with the last few characters, the 23rd of February 18. It tells you in the right hand side what it does. This is version 1.71. It explains that it supports NES games out of the box. So I'm going to tick that box there and add this particular one, which is the 171 standard. That's going to do NES games. We also want to do 32X games. So obviously we've ticked that standard one. We're now going to find the 32X one. The 32X uses something called, I think it's Pico drive. So I'm just looking down here now to see if I can find the 32X core. There it is. Yep, it was right in front of me, Pico drive there. It explains it supports 32X, and that's the top one from the ROM. So I'm going to tick that box because we want to put 32X ones on there. Next up, we've got Sega Master System. So I guess we want to find one that supports Sega Master System. And I know that the Genesis plus GX one supports Sega Master System ones. So I'm going to tick that box. As you can see, it says SMS in the list here. Also, I want PC Engine for Bonk's Adventure. So I'm going to look for the PC Engine one. And I think that is... let's have a good look for it. I think it's Mediafen PCE Fast. There it is. Mediafen PCE Fast. Got that. Next one's an N64 one. So again, this is just adding the ability to run those particular type of ROMs. The best one for N64 I found was something called Glupin. Oh, that's right there, right underneath the Genesis plus GX. So I'm going to check that box. King of Fighters. Now, we need several really to run MAME ROMs, or rather Neo Geo ROMs as well. So what we're going to check for this one, we're going to choose MAME, or rather the KM BIOS Neo Uni FB 2012. I think that one should do that. We also have the FB Alpha 2016 here, which I'm going to check as well. That one does the FB 2016, which you'll see in a moment. Game Boy, want to add one for that. I think there's a GBA one somewhere. Let me just find that. Again, I usually have these all separate, but I thought I'd download the latest and just try and wing it. Alright, yeah, there's one down here for GBA, I think. SNES 9X if you want to do the SNES 9X core. Okay, I can't see it there. I'm going to keep looking. There are a lot in here. A lot of different cores. Ah, there we go. KMMGBA. That will run GBA ROMs. Oh, we've got Mega Drive. We know that one's going to work because we added the Sega Master System one and that supported Mega Drive. And Mario All-Stars. I'm personally just going to use the inbuilt Canoe one. Now that's the one that came with the Super Nintendo from Nintendo. I click on OK, and now it's asking me to update the NES. Sorry, the SNES. Let's go down here and have a look what state it's in right now. So you can't update it while it's got this in place. So to update it, you're going to have to disconnect the on-the-go adapter and directly plug in to there. And then when you turn it on, it says it wants to be in FEL mode, I believe. It says install driver. No, I'm just going to cancel that. Or do I? No, I'll try and put it in FEL mode anyway. So power off. I'm going to hold down reset and power back on. So there we go. So now it's just building the custom image. It's building them with those additional requirements that we needed in order to run other systems ROMs. So obviously on the right hand side there, you can see the ROMs that I'm going to transfer. Just one of each system for now. But in theory, you'd be able to transfer many from each system, split them up into folders, which again, I'll show you how to do if you want to see that. But once I finish this step, I'm basically going to revert to my own setup and show you how you can make it look at the end of it. Thanks very much for the likes, guys, a thumbs up. I'm trying to get through this. It's quite painful. I appreciate it. It's, you know, I'm trying to do the multi-boot. I'm trying to do multiple cores, RetroArch on there, additional systems ROMs, a custom boot screen, everything in one video. Just because people asked for it. You know, I prefer to do separate ones, and there are out there. You can have a look on my channel. I do have separate videos for different modifications. But this is kind of the ultimate all-in-one. Let's do it. Let's get everything set up in a particular way so you can do everything you want to do. You could also run PlayStation ROMs on there, or PlayStation ISO images. That's possible. I have it as part of my setup. All you have to do is look for one of the cores when you add extra modules that supports PlayStation. Looks like the kernel's nearly done. It's getting there. Now, I don't believe it's necessary to enter FEL mode to transfer the modifications. I'm not sure why it was wanting me to do that. Normally, you can just switch on the power and do the transfer, and it doesn't take half as long. So I'm just going to go to the modules now and say uninstall, and I'm going to see what mods it says I have. Well, these are the mods it says I have. So it says I have the standard RetroArch, which is needed. That is the base, and that's needed for NES games. We've got the 32X support there. We've got the Game Boy support. We've got the PC Engine support, the N64, the Genesis, the Master System, Mega CD by the look of it. FB Alpha's good. That's a good core for running MAME games. And we've got the Neo Geo core there with all the BIOS in and everything like that. So yeah, that looks okay. So next up, we transfer the games in, and it's simply drag and drop. So I'm going to drag and drop each one. In fact, let me just drag and drop all of them at once and see what happens. In fact, let me drag everything apart from the zip file. You'll see in a moment why not to drag the zip file across directly in. I think the default is to actually compress these, as you can see. And as the zip is already compressed, we don't want to drag it in with the compress checked. So let me drag the others in. So now the last one just remaining is the King of Fighters one. And for the King of Fighters, we don't want the compress on, so we need to take that one off. Is there a way to stop the compression? Yep, there is. Compress games when adding, just take that off. And let's drag that last zip in. I'm going to import as an archive. There we go. So now these are extra, these are the new ROMs that we're adding. So if there's anything you're unsure about at this time, this is where things can and will go wrong. So F0, you can see it's there. You could add an image for it if you wanted. I guess that's the best thing to do. Just make sure that the right command line is stated down here. So mine says /bin/n64. I know that that is the correct command line. And you can check the command lines by going to your uninstall extra modules at this point and just double checking what it was for Glupin. So you can see it supports the N64. I think it's automatically doing that. So I'm checking the Afterburner one. Yep, that's got Afterburner and the 32X. Aladdin, SMS, that's correct. Bonk's Adventure, PCE, Bart, yep. Mario All-Stars, yep, that's using the standard. As you can see, Mario All-Stars uses the Clover command line, which is the built-in emulator. Pokemon Ruby uses GBA, bin.gba, that's good. And King of Fighters, this is the one that we have to edit. King of Fighters, it's just saying zip. We don't have anything that supports zip. It doesn't know what it is, it's just a zip file. So this is the part. If you're going to bring in a zip file, you have to tell it which core you want to use to open the zip file. Now, the core that I'm going to select here is and I'm going to double check just to make sure I get it right, and you should also double check, it's the FB Alpha 2016. So I'm going to make sure it's using that particular core. So I can copy, hopefully, there. I'm going to come back to this, and I'm going to see if I can paste. If I can't paste, yep, I can paste. Excellent. So, if you want, you could Google for these missing images. How do we do that? Do we right click and then say download box art for all games or something? Download missing box art. Was it not around here somewhere? I don't know where it is. Anyway, let's highlight them all and just say download box art for selected games. It seems to be taking its time. It normally goes a little bit quicker than this, but in this window you can see what it's doing. And the operation timed out. It's timed out again by the look of it, and it's going to time out again. I'm not sure why it does this. I guess it might be a bug, or it's a problem on my end. So we're just going to cancel it and say we don't want the box art, and all I'll do is export the games now, and I'm going to export them to the US firmware. Sorry, the European firmware. It does put them in an unsorted folder, so you could put them in a folder and separate them all out into separate folders with a different icon for each one. So for instance, We could call this folder, I'm clicking on it now, we could call it 32X. And then we could choose a 32X icon. So I'm just going to find a RetroPie Sega 32X icon like that. And that'll be the icon that we see on the menu. We could add new folders, which I have here. I'm going to bring it into the root. So there's a new folder down the bottom now. And I could say other games or whatever. But effectively, what you might want to do is separate them all out into separate subfolders, one for each platform. In fact, do you know what? I think there's a nice, quick and easy way of doing that. Inside this 32X folder, I'm just going to click on Split by App Type. And there it is. It's actually labeled each folder. But obviously we don't need them inside the 32X folder, so what we'll do is we'll transfer them all out into the root. Like that, just drag and drop. And we're going to, this FB 2016, it still doesn't know what it is, but we know, of course, it's the Neo Geo. So I'm just going to type in Neo Geo there. There we go. And I'm going to put that one in the root as well. So now in the root, what we should be able to see is all these additional subfolders with a single game in each. You're free to put as many games in there, and I did. So I'm going to go to the Genesis. Again, I'm choosing the RetroArch ones because they're quite nice. So I'm going to choose the Mega Drive because that is my console and the jurisdiction I'm in. Let's see, Sega Master System. Click on the thumbnail. Let's do the same thing. Where is it? Sega MS, is it? Or is it just Master System? There it is. 32X. We deleted the old folder, but we put this one in. Sega 32X. There it goes. Super NES. Of course, this is the additional game. This is the Mario All-Stars one in here. So I'm just going to do that. Game Boy Advance. RetroPie GBA. Nintendo 64. Come on. N64. There we go. Neo Geo. You should have one for that as well. And the TurboGrafx 16, or rather the PC Engine as it was called more generically. Okay, so that's it. You can choose where you want these icons, if you want them on the left or the right. At the moment they're all on the right. The way you move them about is by clicking on here and saying left. And now you can see it moves to the left of the games. But I'm going to put them all on the right. Like that. So they're all down there. Click on OK. Say yep. That's going to make those links for us. And that, my friends, is it. We've now got the ultimate setup. You can add more ROMs, add as many as you like. If you want to group them separately so that they're not all in new apps, simply go to View and Group by App Type. And then down the bottom, you'll notice that you've got them all separated into different sections. So when you're adding new ones, if you're adding Sonic, if you're adding Bonk's Adventure, whatever you're adding, just drag them in and they should be put in the separate ones. And again, you can sort them out into the right folders using the folder manager. So I'm just going to exit this and let's see what this looks like. So right now the Super Nintendo is still powered on after we added all of those cores. I'm going to power it down. Wait until the light goes out. Take out the power. Let's put the power in the on-the-go adapter. Make sure we get it the right way round. Yeah, once again, make sure we get it the right way round. Is that right? No, a flat one that way round. Okay. Plug in the USB on the go. You can plug it in any of the different ones. I've plugged it in there. And let's connect this up. So now effectively, not only can we multi-boot, we can also run other consoles firmwares. Sorry, other consoles ROMs. So it's powering on now. I'm going to switch over. We'll watch this thing boot. and then we'll navigate to the folders that contain the ROMs and play them. In theory, that is. It happened to drop us in this folder. I've no idea why that was. So let's have a look. From the root, we've got the original firmwares that we set up first. We've got all the games from the standard firmware that we're running now, and then on the right hand side we've got these consoles set up. So let's see if it worked. Absolutely perfect. As with the modification for the standard console, down and select is the default way to get out without hitting reset. You no longer have to use a reset button on the console. Just press down and select, and it will return back to the main menu. Okay, now let's try Neo Geo. This might be the tricky one. King of Fighters 99. Nope, that clearly didn't work. So I'm just going to skip that one for now. I'm going to try the next system across, which was N64. And I had F-Zero X in there. That seems good. All looks fine. I'm going to hit start and select. And you can see this is the new RetroArch interface that's included in 171 from KMFD Manic. Great. Hit start and select to go back to the game. And I could play this if I had a pad that had an analog stick on. So I'm going to hit down and select and get back out to the main menu. I'm going to try the other systems out before we finish this tutorial. Next up, we've got Game Boy Advance and Pokemon Ruby. Again, feel free to add the artwork using Hakchi CE. That looks good. There you go, you can see it's the Pokemon Ruby game working fine. Again, I haven't got much time. I think my wife's going to be hunting me down soon. Come back out. Next console is the Super Nintendo, Super NES. And we've got Mario All-Stars. This is just using the default emulator included with the Nintendo. So this isn't using RetroArch. Pressing start and select will not get you to the RetroArch menu here. It's the default emulator, as I've said. So again, this was the Super Nintendo kind of upgraded version of Super Mario Bros. 3. Down and select exits and back out. Next system we have is the 32X. And we have Afterburner. Sega running on a Nintendo console. Joy. Okay, so that's working fine. Down and select exits out again. We've got Mega Drive. I've no reason to believe this wouldn't work fine. Again, whenever you're using RetroArch, you can hit down and select, and you've got lots of different options. Sorry, you can hit start and select, and you've got lots of options in there. Obviously, if you want to take a screenshot, save state, change the shaders, there's absolutely tons of things that you can do in here. You can also go directly to the Recents menu and open up the ROMs that you were previously playing using RetroArch directly from there. Now I just had the Nintendo just reboot for some reason. I've not really had this before. Is it going to come back? No, it's not. So I'm going to power off and power back on again. I've no idea why that random reboot happened. It's new to me. It could simply have been the fact that it was an unhandled crash or something like that. So Sega Mega Drive seems to be working. Let's try the Master System one just to round this off. And we've got Aladdin. That seems to be absolutely fine. Down and select to exit out. So that's it. This is my Super Nintendo Classic European firmware with multi-boot all set up, with one minor hiccup, I guess, and that is the fact that we haven't managed to get the Neo Geo games running. But I'm sure it's just a simple... Sorry about that, minor connection issue. As I was saying, if you have any questions, please leave them below the video, and what I will do is I will upload all of the links that I use, links to Amazon, links to somewhere that you can buy these, whatever, links to the boot image. All you'll have to do is provide your own ROMs, or your own backups in this case. Alright guys, this has been Turboman UK, wishing you a very good weekend, or a very good week, or whenever you're watching this. Please like, please subscribe. Subscriptions are good because it means that YouTube eventually will succumb to my 1,000 when I get there and start paying me again. Alright, thanks very much guys. Take care.